Well, I think Henry Kissinger needs no introduction at an occasion like this, or indeed at any occasion. I want to begin, Dr. Kissinger, with a question about the past. But it's a question prompted by something that you said last week in New York, when you said that conflict between the United States and China could result in a catastrophic outcome that will be worse than the world wars that ruined European civilization unless the two countries can settle their differences. It's no longer possible to think that one side can dominate the other, you said. Dr. Kissinger, I want to take you back in time to when you first began to think about the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It was you who flew secretly to Beijing on July the 9th, 1971, and began a new era in relations between these two countries. But you had been thinking about it for many years. Between China and the Soviet Union must not be overlooked, and if it occurs, we should take advantage of it rather than force the erstwhile partners into a new alliance through intransigence. And that same year, in a paper for Nelson Rockefeller, whom you for many years advised, you said, "Our policy should be to test the interest of communist China in improving relations with us." People sometimes think it was Richard Nixon who had this idea, but I think it's fairly clear that you were thinking about it before he was. So what was the original conception that you had of the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic?
My basic view of the stability of the international system is that it requires equilibrium. And so, really based on relative ignorance about China itself, simply looking at the components of the international system, I did in my early thinking believe, one, that China, by its magnitude, is bound to be a major factor in the international system. And secondly, that in a system that included China, it was advantageous or desirable for the United States to be closer to China. As time went on, of course, it became more obvious that China is a cultural organism, and therefore understanding its culture and its special view of history was an essential requirement of the system.
In the subsequent years, from 1971 really until now, you have been the American most involved in the evolution of the relationship, meeting with the leaders, the presidents on both sides on numerous occasions. It's been an extraordinary role that you've played, and it's extended far beyond your time in government. It feels as if the relationship has gone sour. And I went back to your book on China, which is now 8 years old, to try to think about why that might be. You asked a question in that book, the question, and I quote, whether China's rise would make international relations bipolar again. I have begun to wonder if we are already in the early stages of a new Cold War that goes far beyond a dispute about trade. But you lived through the Cold War from beginning to end. Do you see resemblances in the situation today with the early stages of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, only now it's China?
Well, there's a huge difference. The Cold War, in a way, was declared by the Soviet Union. At the end of the Second World War, the United States leadership was very ready for a close relationship with Russia. But Stalin was convinced that the ideological differences were so great that he could not hold his system together. Not so much his system as the Eastern conquest, in an atmosphere of cooperation with the United States. So in the late 40s, with the blockade of Berlin and other challenges, it was the Soviet Union which started the crises that produced the Cold War. Then as time went on, it received an ideological component as well from the United States. And through much of the Cold War, it was believed that the two systems were irreconcilable. As time went on, and in the period in which I was in office, having gone through several Berlin crises and the Cuban Missile Crisis, you could not avoid facing the consequences of a Cold War turning into a hot war. And with nuclear weapons, you had to ask the question of how the leaders of both sides could face their publics without having explored at least the possibility of limiting the impact of these weapons on each other. So we started in the previous administration with the test ban agreement. But we started a formal negotiation about restraints on nuclear weapons, which were a break in the Cold War pattern. But the Cold War continued in context in the colonial period, in the colonial parts of the world. And so we were in a strange situation in which on the one hand there were conflicts in Vietnam that were supported by the Soviet Union with substantial military equipment, and simultaneously negotiations on controlling the nuclear weapons, which represented the ultimate threat. And this went on until the Soviet Union collapsed. In our period, we do not yet have this degree of rivalry, but we also don't have formal negotiations to reduce the political conflict. And the reason I described the potential of the situation as catastrophic is China and the United States are countries of a magnitude exceeding that of the Soviet Union and America. The Soviet Union was not an economically significant country. We had no economic relations to speak of with the Soviet Union at all. And the Soviet Union did not appear on the international scene as a major economic country. China is a major economic country, and so are we. And so we are bound to step on each other's toes all over the world, in the sense of being conscious of the purposes of the other. So, a discussion of our mutual purposes and an attempt to limit the impact of conflicts seems to me essential. And therefore, if conflict is permitted to run unconstrained, the outcome could be even worse than it was in Europe. World War I broke out because a relatively minor crisis could not be mastered. That is a danger in this world, even more so. And the weapons are more powerful and, above all, more sophisticated.
Because in some ways, a Cold War would not be the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario, as you've just said, would be a hot war. In On China, you quote the Air Crow Memorandum of 1907, and you say, at the most superficial level, China is, as was Imperial Germany, a resurgent continental power. The United States, like Britain, is primarily a naval power with deep political and economic ties to the continent. Could the rise of the Anglo-German antagonism replay itself? And that's one of the questions that Graham Allison asked in his book, recently published, Destined for War. So the worst case scenario wouldn't be a Cold War, it would be a hot war. But what would such a hot war be over? It clearly wouldn't be over trade policy. What would be the equivalent of, say, Belgium in 1914 that might trigger the kinds of conflict that worries you?
Well, interestingly enough, Belgium didn't trigger the conflict. The conflict took place in the Balkans. And the war began with a military operation. The conflict was between Austria and Serbia in the Balkans. And the war began with a German attack on Belgium.
But Britain only came in
and then Britain came in.
Yeah.
And then it could not be limited.
So is there something like that today that worries you that could be a flashpoint between the US and China?
History does not necessarily repeat itself precisely. So there is no book in which you can apply precisely. But in the various conflicts that exist around the world, if a situation develops in which the United States and China are obliged to take opposite positions in order to achieve the maximum degree of support on a global basis, then it is conceivable. I would even say likely that some conflict will become a hard conflict. But since both countries are powerful enough to prevent themselves from being defeated, there is no automatic limit to escalation. And I think it would be dangerous for mankind if the leaders of both countries became so adjusted to seeing every issue in the world in terms of conflict with China on the American side. And also, if the idea developed in each country that the other side, at a minimum, must be put into a position where it can no longer threaten it. And when you add to that the evolution of technology, not just in the scope of the weapons, but in the scope of the automaticity of the mechanical world, then we are living in a world we should not permit to arise.
I've been very struck by the way that in the space of less than 2 years, the relationship has gone from being about trade and tariffs to being about technology, from 5G to artificial intelligence, and now, maybe since October of last year when Vice President Pence gave his speech at the Hudson Institute, we seem to be in the realm of politics. And the most recent example of this is the response of the U.S. Congress to events in Hong Kong, with both houses of Congress passing legislation that is certainly seen as provocative from the vantage point of Beijing. Is this something that we should be worried about? Is this the kind of flashpoint that you have in mind?
Hong Kong is bound to be a highly emotional issue in Britain, in China, being the first colony or first territory that was extracted from China in the period of colonialism. So its return to China has a highly symbolic quality. The United States, through its history, saw Hong Kong as a relatively minor issue. So now when a series of dramatic events are unfolding, each side is bound to be influenced by its historical perception. And the United States is undergoing an election at the moment. So what the people emotionally understand is a very dominant factor. I hope that the issue will be settled by negotiation that maintains the principles by which decolonization was carried out some period ago. I have not been in the United States in the last week, so I don't know the details of what the Congress passed. But I hope that a solution will be found compatible with the principles that I've just mentioned. And I believe that this is possible, and it should be likely.
It's fair to say that it's not the first time that the U.S. Congress has been more hawkish on China than the White House. This goes back a long way, right to the beginning, really, of your period in American politics. There's always been a pattern of hawkish language from Congress, hasn't there?
Yes, because the Congress as an institution is influenced by essentially domestic considerations. And it does not follow in detail all the nuances that are relevant to the Chinese-American relationship from a historic point of view. that makes it, in my view, especially important that a period of relative tension be followed by an explicit effort to understand what the political causes are, and a commitment by both sides to try to overcome those. It is far from being too late for that, because we are still in the foothills of a Cold War. And for 40 years after the opening to China, the manner of dealing with each other was positive. There were differences, but essence of a military conflict. So, I have in America advocated this point of view, and it was the dominant point of view until about 3 years ago. And the rapidity with which it's changed should itself be a warning as to the nature in which domestic considerations can influence matters. When we started with China, the idea of China being a military threat was never seriously considered. And if you look at the history, it really developed only in the last 10 years, in part because modern technology produces capacities that were unthinkable a decade ago. So even a normal evolution of China would shrink the comparative balance of power by the mere nature of modern ideology. So that to reduce that concern by formal policy is in a way a new task that had not been really considered before, because in the evolution of the post-Nixon period, we had problems with China, we had disagreements, but they were not considered part of a global struggle. They were considered in their own terms. This new situation is partly an impact of technology, partly the impact of different political systems. But we had lived with those before.
We're out of time, but I'm going to presume on the organizers' patience by asking you one last question. Your phrase, the foothills of the Cold War, is echoing in my mind, and I remember your point that the Cold War was started by Stalin, was started by the Soviet Union. And it seems as if we're implying that the big change of the last 3 years has really come from the American side. But I wonder if that's entirely true. Can one see some Chinese responsibility for the change in the relationship that has happened in the last few years? And if so, what kind of advice would you give China's leaders if they had to de-escalate this situation?
I did not mean to imply that it was the United States. The point I was trying to make is that China, by the development of its capacities to an objective observer represented inherently a greater threat than when Chinese leaders referred to that capacity, which had come about not necessarily from the point of view of making a threat, but from the point of view of making China strong. When Chinese leaders, in the natural evolution of their policy. So I don't consider that China started it, history started this, that both countries were caught in a new situation which they had to interpret. And they both acted in a way compatible with what had gone before and which had been quite positive before. And they have not yet been able to reconstruct this. And so now trade negotiations has become a kind of substitute. But everybody knows that trade negotiations, which I hope will succeed, and whose success I'm supporting, they can only be a small beginning to a political discussion that I hope will take place in the years ahead.
Dr. Kissinger, it will soon be 50 years since you touched down in Beijing on that historic day in 1971. I hope that will be a 50th anniversary that the world takes time to celebrate and to reflect on. We've all been extraordinarily fortunate to have the benefit of your unparalleled wisdom today, and I'd just like to invite everybody in this audience to express their gratitude to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.